Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today for our webinar, where I'll be joined by my colleagues at F5 and Tenable to explore the subject of Active Directory security in a bit more detail on how we can impose some best practice in this space. So just to kick off, I will start with the typical housekeeping slide. Just to fill you in, if you're not familiar with this platform, you're in mute, listen only mode at the moment. If you do have any questions, I would encourage you to use the question box, which should be in the pop-up that you've got probably to the right of your screen at the moment, should you need to. Do chuck those in along the way. There'll be a Q&A section towards the end of the session specifically where we'll go through any of your questions. The session is being recorded. We'll make a link to the recording available to you in the follow-up directly after the webinar, so you can re-watch if you need to. And last but not least, towards the end of the session, we'll launch a very quick feedback form for yourselves. If you could fill that in, that would really help us, helps us kind of make these as best we can in the future as well. So moving swiftly on, the agenda for today's session, we'll cover off a little bit about Bytes. I won't take the limelight for too long at all though, before we dive straight into the good stuff. So we'll hear first from Kieran at F5, and then we'll be hearing from Chris at Tenable. And here are just some of the points that we're going to cover off. So we will look at conditional access from a Microsoft perspective and how we can tie into that. We'll look at common misconfiguration mistakes within your AD environment, how to catch changes that are taking place with potential malicious intent behind them. And of course, we'll look at the end user experience as well, from a workforce user all the way up to your IT teams, and the user experience behind how some of these tools can help streamline some of that for you. And as I say, we'll wrap up with the Q&A section at the end, so do feel free to chuck anything our way in the Q&A box there. So just briefly about Bytes, some of you who frequently join us for our webinars will be very familiar with some of what I'm about to say. But in effect, what Bytes are here to do is be your technology partner to help you make the right choices, not only from a commercial perspective, but also from a strategic perspective across your entire software stack, as well as some of your hardware stack and cloud services as well. That's what we're here to do. If you are engaging with us in that way, excellent. If you haven't thought about engaging us in that way, then take us up on it, reach out to us, and we'll be sure to help. And just delving into a bit more specifically around our security practices, quite a bit of information on the screen at the moment, so I will just highlight some of the key bits for you. Now, Bytes security proposition has kind of gone from strength to strength over the years, and we're a big part of the overall Bytes message now, to the point where we offer things like our Bytes cyber consulting services, where we can provide you with a virtual outsourced CISO. We can help you get up to speed on accreditations like ISO, GDPR, Cyber Essentials, Cyber Essentials Plus, help you get accredited to those standards. We can do things like CIS, benchmark frameworks with you. There's a lot of services we can do outside of simply sourcing technologies for yourselves. But that does lead me nicely onto the topic of today around some of our key technology partners, of which we have a number, but we're quite picky in this space, and we tend to only partner with the best, which is why we're joined today by F5 and Tenable. So without further ado, Kieran, I believe I'm handing over to yourself.
Brilliant, thank you very much for that. Now I'm just going to share my screen. As with all live situations, it's disappeared. There we go. Hopefully you can see my screen now.
Got it, yeah. Oh, we've got yeah, switch that round.
Hopefully that's a little bit better. There we go. Technical issues out of the way. So as I said, thank you for that. Now, as we mentioned through the agenda there's a few different topics that we'd like to go over today. I'm going to concentrate on our side from, we mentioned about leveraging AD, Azure AD, and conditional access policies, and maybe how we can use them for some of your legacy on-premises applications, and also talk about reducing that friction and improving your user experience between applications that are currently hosted on premises, maybe even hooked into your local Active Directory, and maybe some of those modern or future applications that are already hooked into your modern architecture like cloud or SaaS. And then I'm going to hand it over to Chris at Tenable, who will talk more about the the details of protecting the Active Directory. Now, from an F5 point of view, just for those who maybe not sure who we are and have been a leader in application delivery controller for many years now, probably last 20 years. There's a number of logos that are with F5. That Shape is one of those, and we've acquired a few different companies along the way. Some of those you probably recognize, especially around Nginx, which is the current market leading web application server. So that really gives us a footprint into the world of web applications. 38% of the total global market share of web apps sit on an Nginx server, and a leader in things like application delivery controller from our F5 platform. Now, from a Microsoft point of view, we've worked with them for many, many years. We're very close neighbors across the pond. F5 are a Seattle-based company, as are Microsoft, and we've worked closely together over the last couple of decades to ensure that our solutions work seamlessly together. Now, at this point, I don't know if we can pop the poll up on the screen around the Azure identity. There we go. I think that's just popped up. And it'd be interesting to find out from a Microsoft Azure point of view whether you're currently using on-premises AD only, purely Azure AD for the cloud, or a hybrid approach, a combination of both of them. Brilliant. So we'll just leave that up for a second, because we do have a few hundred people on the call today, so we'll give them a second to answer. Great. Now, I don't know if we show those results instantly or if we'll show them later on. There we go. So that is interesting. So a huge proportion there of people on the call having a hybrid approach, which is not uncommon. Now, hopefully you can see my slides again there. Fantastic. The story, if you'd kind of believed and talked to everyone under the sun, is that cloud is utopia and everyone's in the cloud, and if you're not there, what are you doing? I guess the major difference is that cloud is sometimes a target, but movement to the cloud also means moving your applications to the cloud, as we just saw there, moving your on-premises identity to the cloud, taking up things like identity as a service solutions from Azure. And there's never always a holistic approach. As we saw from the 90% there, a huge proportion of organizations are having to utilize both identity as a service in the cloud and their traditional identity as part of Microsoft AD. And that can cause a few headaches and can obviously open up a few security holes as well. Most of the organizations we've talked to at F5 Labs, and there's a few various sources like McKinsey and things on this screen, we can see, not dissimilar to the results here, 60 to 80% of enterprise workloads will remain on premises. And there is a varying amount of reasons behind that. It could be because they're legacy applications, they are, they're built on some old Fortran or Cobalt code. It doesn't migrate very well. They don't support modern authentication. They can't support the latest crypto standards. There are numerous amounts of reasons of why that is the situation. But that is the status quo, and that's what we have to live with. And that's what, as security professionals, we have to try and achieve the same level of security compliance for these applications. So in a nutshell, we need to simplify. We need to simplify the access to our hybrid applications. We've already mentioned we're on a hybrid approach between ID as a service, SaaS applications, cloud applications, and a huge amount of on-premises applications. And this is where F5 are trying to integrate into that solution or into that problem to provide a good solution for our customers. Now, the core around this is having a good identity and using identity as your control plane. I'm not going to go into the whole story around zero trust, but this is a key element and a key pillar to that is having an identity control plane. Now, in most enterprise applications, they are leveraging some identity as a service or on-prem. So we need to be able to use both of those and place the applications in the right place, but more importantly, give customers a single log-on experience and enable security professionals to be able to protect that application wherever it may live. Now, from an F5 point of view, we can live in many places. We can live in the world of SaaS. We have our own SaaS platforms. We can live in the cloud, many marketplaces, and as a huge amount of our customers have as on-premises as ADCs, whether that be physical or virtual appliance. So what we want to do is utilize that infrastructure and try and stitch it all together. Now, if I look at a couple of use cases here, what we've got here is a customer that's maybe has some SaaS applications that are available using Azure AD, wants to be able to have that single sign-on experience through Azure's My Applications, but still have access to the on-premises applications. And we can do that through SAML integration, where the F5 actually becomes a service provider for the AD identity store, which is an identity provider, and can redirect that traffic, which we have published into Azure. And that's the key thing there, that we can publish these legacy applications that don't live in the cloud. As far as your customers are concerned, they just pop up and appear as another box on their cloud-based login. The other use case we can look at as well is IDP chaining, where they still want to access the applications in Azure, but in this case, maybe the federation hasn't taken place, or maybe the user identity is still held in that local Active Directory store. So in this case, we can do IDP chaining, where the Azure ID sent an IDP chaining request over to the F5, which is acting as another identity provider. It will then query and authenticate against a local Active Directory identity store, and then as long as that application meets those authentication requirements, we can hand that off to the on-premises application. What's nice about that is we're still using local AD, but we can then start to utilize some of the tools that are available in Azure AD that maybe aren't available for these on-premises apps, like conditional access and things like that. So as you can see, it's a fairly simplistic architecture. There shouldn't be anything too new here for anyone, but it's the way that we can integrate with with this Azure AD and make it a seamless approach, which makes it a very nice solution. So the way we do that is we utilize Microsoft Graph. If you haven't heard of Graph, it's essentially Microsoft's next generation API. It's been out for a while now, but it enables you to do, pretty much anything that you need to do in Azure through the Microsoft Graph API. And what we've done is we've allowed our administrators to be able to configure the on-premises apps and the application they require and the access they require on the F5 and only on the F5. And it will push all of the information needed up to Azure to allow that application to be enrolled into the My Applications workspace so it can be accessed as part of a cloud-based application. Why are we doing this? There's a few challenges around application access. Simplifying access is one of them we mentioned. We don't want to give our users different logon experiences based on where those applications are held. That doesn't help the user experience. It doesn't help with being able to apply consistent security across those applications if we're trying to constantly manage two different access flows. The other thing we find with all applications is a huge amount of credential theft and misuse, whether that be through things like automated traffic, credential stuffing, automated brute force attacks. As local AD and Azure AD are not immune to any of those types of attacks. So by enabling the F5 and Microsoft to sit in front of all of those applications allows us to implement some of those solutions. So you saw some of those F5 logos at the beginning there. Shape was one of those logos where we can actually use, AI and machine learning. We look at billions of logins a day across a number of different customers, and we can use threat tactics packages to look at those logins, try to enumerate whether they're automated or human, or whether they're trying to implement some sort of fraudulent transactions. Now, I'm not going to go too detailed into the features because we haven't got a huge amount of time today, but there are a number of things that we're trying to do from the F5 side, and one of those is a continuous verification. It's no good verifying your user when they access an application and they hit the identity store for the first time. Because the F5 is the proxy point for all applications, we call it an identity aware proxy. It actually enables us to continuously check things like device posture, but not on a per session basis, actually on a per request basis. So every single request that's made from that client to that application can be validated against third party or third party to F5, so things like Microsoft Intune posture checking, F5's local posture checking, and also making sure that the client is still conforming to the right authentication requirements. So we could have policies where maybe they've moved to a different part of the application that may require further step-up authentication, or may have breached some of the conditional access. Because we're checking that on a per request basis, we can immediately implement it. We also hook into other third-party services as well. So it could be Tenable, it could be another vendor that has some other risk assessment on your organization. As long as they have an API that we can query that API, we can obtain the result, and based on that result, we can decide whether or not to give access to that application, or whether that application requires further validation through, additional maybe two-factor authentication, step-up authentication, etc., etc. So we mentioned Microsoft's conditional access. This is a very, feature-rich feature that they offer, and because it's hooked into Microsoft Azure AD, it obviously allows us to use a number of conditions and apply a number of controls based on that. So platform's not an issue, whether you're running from your Google, iOS, macOS devices. We can pick up on things like geolocation, where you're coming from, what type of browser you're using, whether you're, if you're on an Intune customer, you can look at device posture, whether your camera's turned off. All of these can add to the security posture that enables you to make an informed decision on whether that application is not allowed, and the important is allowed or not. And the important thing to remember is we're not just talking about applications now that have been pushed into Azure. We're talking about legacy on-premises applications, maybe even authenticating against local Active Directory. So from an F5 point of view, we're trying to make things easy, not just for the consumer of the application and the user, but also for the administrator and the administrator who wants to be able to, enroll these services. So that's fundamentally the crux of what we're talking about today, is how can I seamlessly onboard those applications, those legacy applications, into an Azure work stream. So if I just quickly break out of this, I think I've got a couple more minutes. I'll very quickly show you what we were talking about. If I can find my right screen, let's have a look. Here we go. So this is the guided configuration within F5, and you can see here we have a Microsoft integration button. So if I just go on to one of the applications I've got here, now there's a minimal amount of information that you need to configure about your on-premises application, the first thing it's going to tell you is that Microsoft Azure AD, we're going to use the Graph API, and that there are some access that you need to configure on the Azure AD. So within your Azure Enterprise applications, you'll need to allow these API permissions through. That's the minimal information and configuration that you need to do on Azure. So from then, it's just about inserting your tenant and client IDs from Azure, inserting your service information. So in this case, I have an app called Blue Sky, which is currently on-prem. I want to be able to publish that. Placing your Azure Active Directory information, giving details about the local application and where it lives. So here I've got sitting on a private IP address. I'm connecting it to a via SSL. There could be a pool of those applications, so I can actually point that to a pool. And then some trivial information around session management, access timeouts, things like that. So you can see there's not a huge amount of information that I have to add there. But the key thing is that when I get to the end of this, I can then deploy this application by hitting this deploy button, and that will go off using Microsoft Graph. We'll go and publish that application into Azure, so that this application that lives on-prem will be available through the My Applications portal as if it were just any other cloud-based application. And all of those services that I want to add on there around, conditional access can all be done as well in in Azure. So hopefully, if I just go and refresh this page, my enterprise application will have automatically appeared. This is a live demo. There we go. So it has been published. We can see there into Azure. And I think I've got a remote desktop here, so I tried to access it before, and hopefully this should access. There we go. And actually, if I go into My Applications, which is the applications portal here, we can see that local on-premises application has now appeared as a My Applications app in my cloud-based login. It's timed out here, so it's obviously just making me re-authenticate. Now, what's interesting, because this is tied to my corporate account as well, it's also hooked in things like my Microsoft Duo token. So when I log in for this for the first time, it will force me to go and authenticate, even though I haven't set that up on-prem, and I haven't set that up as part of my legacy application, because it's part of my Azure tenant and my domain login. It will ask me to do that. So hopefully that explained a little bit about what we do and how we can drag some of those kicking and screaming applications that actually you really want to be able to provide your customers with a single login experience, but you're just not sure how. Hopefully this makes things a little bit easier. So we're going to concentrate more on the actual protecting of those on-premises AD services now, and I'm going to hand over to Chris.
Cool, thank you, Kieran. Just going to share out my screen. Cool, hopefully everyone can see that okay. If someone can just give me a little nod or a yes to say that that's good.
Can see that.
Great, thanks. So look, everyone, just to introduce myself, I'm Chris Eves, one of the security engineers here for North EMEA at Tenable. Now, I came over as part of an acquisition that Tenable made in April this year of a little Active Directory practice based out of France. So for anyone previously familiar with Tenable, very predominant in the vulnerability management space. It didn't really have much around kind of Active Directory or the identity piece, and that's where the acquisitions come in to fill a bit of a gap. Now we're just going to talk about some Active Directory best practices. We're going to focus predominantly on the on-premise Active Directory, as that's where we see a lot of the problems. We still see a lot of organizations having that, which was pretty evident based on the poll that Kieran asked earlier. So quick agenda for, sorry, I've just paused that somehow, I think. Okay. So quick agenda, we're just going to talk about how we start to look at and disrupt common attack paths. So we'll delve into a bit more detail behind kind of what that means. We're going to talk about why privileges are what attacker wants, and then we're going to go through some best practices, techniques that are a bit more involved than just kind of removing privileges from user accounts. Although that's a good idea, we're going to talk about some maybe less known techniques. If we get a bit of time at the end, we're going to have a quick look at the demonstration. I can show you how some of this starts to work and then fits together. So let's talk about disrupting attack paths. When we look at kind of Active Directory and really what attackers look to do once they get inside organizations, now I'm not going to talk about initial foothold and how they get inside because that's not really where we're focusing. But once they do get inside, they often take a very similar kind of sequence of events or similar sequence of steps that allow them to move laterally, to start escalating privileges, to establish command and control, to establish persistence, and then ultimately perform the basis of the attack, whether that's deploying malware, holding the business to ransom, or exfiltrating data. And this is really important to understand because often this leverages misconfigurations and weaknesses that exist in Active Directory. Now, if we take the on-premise Active Directory environment, first iteration came out in 1999, so has been around for 22 years. During that time, we've seen organic growth, we've seen businesses increasing, we've seen lots of different business units coming along, we've seen regionalized growth now, we see mergers and acquisitions happening a lot, and all of this starts to add and increase complexity, management overhead, an environment that we need to support, but ultimately understand exactly what's going on inside. And this now becomes a big challenge for a lot of organizations. So what we want to do is make sure that we can understand how these attack paths fit together, which is what Tenable AD does. So we're going to gather information from Active Directory. We're going to put it all into a graphical database. And then what we're going to do is start to understand the relationships between all of these objects. How an attacker potentially could get initial foothold on an endpoint, and how they can use that endpoint to then move laterally into a group, move laterally to another object that may be another computer account, and keep going until they get to a server, or then maybe onto the next stage where they get hold of a privileged account or a domain controller. Now, the really important bit behind this is that we're going to be doing this continuously across the Active Directory environment. Now, a lot of solutions that play in this space do a point-in-time assessment, a point-in-time audit, or we end up gathering the security logs of our domain controllers. And what we end up doing then is gathering all these logs, forwarding them into the likes of a SIM, where we start to correlate these events together. We're going to put a attack path analysis on it. We're going to receive replication events from Active Directory. We're going to understand any time a small or big change in Active Directory is made. We're going to understand the impact that that may have on certain attack paths and how attackers can leverage that. And then we're going to flag those as alerts, making sure that we're going to be able to stop attackers exploring the organization, elevating privileges, evading detection, establishing control, and ultimately then exfiltrating data. So why is it privileges are what attackers are after? Well, firstly, they're going to try and get hold of an endpoint. They're going to prey on those endpoints or prey on those user accounts. And Kieran's already mentioned, credential stuffing attacks, brute force attacks, password spray attacks, lots of different ways that they may try and get hold of either initial user accounts or credentials. They're then going to try and compromise that endpoint. And that could be through a vulnerability, it could be through a CVE, it could be through a weakness on that endpoint. And they're often going to go for local admin privileges. Now, local admin privileges, they can do this in a number of different ways. They can try and use a CD or a USB key, for example, to put it in and reset the local admin password. There's lots of different ways that they can try and do this. They can harvest those credentials directly from memory on the database. They're then going to try and look to recon and understand exactly how maybe the organization starts to fit together. And this could be using tools such as Bloodhound to start mapping out those attack paths and understanding where they can start performing privilege escalation techniques and laterally moving. They might use PowerShell, and they might use very basic commands in PowerShell to understand where certain attributes sits, whether users may have blank passwords, what users are in which groups, for example. They're then going to start looking at attacking Active Directory. Once they've mapped it out using something like Bloodhound, maybe they've gathered the information they need through the likes of PowerShell, they're going to go after weaknesses and misconfigurations. And this usually happens in step 5 to 8 through those kind of sequences of events, or this kind of cyber kill chain that we look at. Again, they can do this using Mimikatz, dumping those credentials, stealing those credentials, or using Powersploit, which is the way that they can start exploiting misconfigurations across networks. We see this across certain tools and applications that are deployed, but it's going to be very easy for them to do this. The reason for this is privileges are always desired. They're going to have limited access with a read-only user account. They may not be able to deploy that malware. They may not be able to get hold of the data that they need. But it's also important to note that it doesn't always require a privileged account. If they can get a non-privileged account that's going to be able to give them the access that they need, again, if that's looking at data, stealing IP, they don't even need to get to that privileged account. We want to make sure the right people are in these groups. We want to make sure the right permissions and the ACLs or the access control lists are granted correctly to each of these objects, whether that's groups, whether that's domain controllers, whether that's group policy objects that are operating on sensitive assets such as our domain controllers. We want to make sure that group policy and the sysfile directory are tidied up, making sure that any Active Directory database configurations are sane and correct. And we want to make sure that users have the correct rights. So now let's look at some individual settings and configuration issues that we see typically across the board. We see these in a lot of different customer environments when we're running proof of concepts, but these are available in every single Active Directory environment, and these are ones that, again, can be exploited. Now, Kerberos delegation, for anyone not familiar with this is different ways that services can run across the organization. There's lots of different ways that delegation can happen. There's lots of different ways that we can configure these settings. I always try and liken this to a bit like a firewall rule for the network. We have different settings that we can set. If we take a setting called unconstrained delegation, it's a bit like having an any rule on your firewall, in that it's a really bad practice. Now we often see this across lots of different objects that may be running old legacy applications, were maybe set for a particular reason, maybe set by accident, maybe they're set just because they don't know the particular setting. And often this is a very difficult thing to start overcoming, particularly where legacy applications or legacy settings are involved. And maybe that asset owner has left the business, maybe that application owner has left the business, we don't know who's running it, we don't know much about the application now, but we still need to make sure the business is protected. So this is often a way that attackers try and impersonate these objects, they try and impersonate these settings. And if something like unconstrained delegation is there on sensitive objects, they're going to be able to start stealing credentials, start stealing Active Directory secrets, and that's going to be a great way that they can use this again to manipulate organizations. So one of the ways that we fix this is by trying to set either constrained delegation, which is making sure that the right services, the right ports, the right applications are talking on these particular objects. Again, a bit like restricting a firewall rule from an any rule to a much more constrained rule of only HTTPS traffic going out, for example, or coming in. We also have the ability to just turn it off completely. Now, it doesn't always work in every scenario, but you can go ahead and configure that. We start to look at service principal names. Now, service principal names are really interesting when they come against privileged objects. And again, we see this in lots of different scenarios, certainly in things like application rollouts where maybe these applications have SQL backends. They're often deployed with a level of privilege, and again, often this can be a highly privileged account such as domain admins. But they go ahead and they configure a service account that's maybe going to run that application. It requires a high level of privilege. We go ahead onto the SQL server or the database server, we install SQL using that service account. And what it's going to do is inject what we call a service principal name or a service ticket into that account. Now, what this does is lower the encryption type of that object from AES down to RC4. So a much weaker encryption type. What attackers look to do is an attack called the curb roasting attack, where with a single event, they're going to request the service ticket of this particular object. And a single event, if you can imagine, quite difficult to detect, quite difficult to start tracking. What they're going to do is take that service ticket offline. Because it's a much weaker encryption type, they're going to be able to decrypt it, brute force it, get into it much quicker than they can an AES type encryption. And once they get into that service ticket, that password is then going to be displayed in clear text. So if you have any service principal names against any privileged objects, attackers can request that service ticket with a single event and then potentially get into that very quickly and get hold of the password. Incredibly damaging if they are domain admin accounts, enterprise admin accounts, or highly privileged accounts. Lots of different ways that we can secure this. We can make sure that those applications are running with the correct privileges. We can make sure that SPNs are not associated to privileged users or privileged groups, or we can use things like group managed service accounts to deploy those applications and run those services where they have slightly different security controls and you can't inject a service principal name inside. Primary group IDs. Again, an old legacy setting in Active Directory. No reason that this should be used in any kind of organization today, but we still see lots of risks against primary group IDs. Now, this is an old legacy attribute that was introduced to allow Unix machines and things like NFS shares to integrate properly with an Active Directory environment in the early days of Active Directory. What it's going to allow those devices to do, those Unix and those NFS devices, is leverage the privileges against that primary group ID. So each group inside Active Directory or each user can have a primary group ID. Often this is set to domain users or domain computers, for example, by default when the account is created. But it can be changed to domain admins. It can be changed to enterprise admins. It can be changed to backup operators. All of these kind of privileged groups that are native to AD. Now, what this does is means that attackers can again leverage this old legacy setting to use those privileges against that object. And they can do this because it may already be there from a legacy setting that's never been changed previously. Again, it may have been set by mistake. Maybe AD admins, support members, help desk teams, whoever are managing these environments, they just weren't aware of the risk associated to that particular change. It can also be changed in a very interesting manner through what we call a DC shadow attack, where they are actually able to change this attribute without actually putting the user into that group, which is not possible to do directly through Active Directory itself. So they can bypass some of the additional controls that Active Directory puts in place to actually protect this particular group. Now, again, a very quick and easy fix here. We just want to make sure that any primary group IDs that are not set to those standard values, for example, they're the 513, which is the domain user group, that we are resetting those values back to their standard default objects. We have the KRB TGT user password, and this is where attackers go after attacks such as golden tickets, bronze tickets, and silver tickets. Now, the KRB TGT account is an account that is created inside every single Active Directory environment or every domain when those objects are created. It's the account that's used to do any Kerberos stamping, any ticket stamping for authentication, accesses to resources, applications, for example. Now, it's a very, very powerful object and is often overlooked by security teams, by infrastructure teams, administration teams. Now, what we want to do is make sure this password is being reset fairly regularly across the organization. I have some customers that now do this weekly or even monthly, whereas previously this hadn't been done for 10, 12, 15 years, or maybe even since the domain was created. And in some examples, that could be as early as 2000 or 2001. Attackers try and guess or brute force the password against this object. If they get into it, they're able to generate a golden ticket, which means they can do whatever they want inside the organization. It's an unlimited ticket that maybe potentially doesn't have an expiry date on it or grants them access to everything inside the organization. So again, we want to make sure this is going to be as difficult as possible for them to generate. And one of the only ways to do that is by just resetting that password regularly. Now, please don't just go off and reset that password or tell your teams to go ahead and do that. There is a bit of a process behind it, and it definitely just requires a bit of reading before we go ahead and do it. It's not like changing a standard user password. So let's go ahead and we'll dive in and we'll take a quick look. So what does this start to look like in a real world scenario? Well, hopefully, again, everyone can see my screen okay, where we can see the Tenable AD dashboard here. And what we're going to do firstly is start to look at the weaknesses, the misconfigurations across an Active Directory environment. We're going to start to put them into severity categories. So we break this down into critical, high, medium, and low. And in each of those categories, we're also going to put a little complexity score against those indicators. The complexity score is about time and effort involved in remediating. So giving you guys as organizations, as security teams, as infrastructure teams, the ability to target quick wins and low-hanging fruit. You're going to want to target on those low complexity scores. You're going to want to improve that AD security posture as quickly as possible. We also want to start to contextualize this information. So we've looked at different types of dangerous delegation in the PowerPoint. If I open up dangerous delegation here, we're going to provide a bit of an executive summary. So again, we're going to start to detail what this is and what this means. We're going to start to show the known attacker tools that are exploiting this particular vulnerability. And then on the right-hand side, we're going to show the domains that are impacted by this particular vulnerability. If you do have a multi-domain, multi-forest environment, you're going to see those domains listed there. As we browse through the tabs, we're going to be able to see vulnerability details. Again, a bit more of an education piece behind why this is important, why this is a risk, and ultimately why as a business we need to remediate this. This is going to help teams that maybe don't know, what this means or doesn't quite understand the risk associated to these objects or these vulnerabilities. This is going to help increase the knowledge there. We then have our deviant objects, so the affected objects that we found inside the organization that pose the risk. Now, we have lots of different headings here. We've got the object heading, which is going to tell us the user or computer that's impacted in this scenario, the path, which is going to tell us where this object resides and which object is affected. And on the right-hand side, we've got the reason it's been flagged and the domain that it sits in. Now, we look for lots of different reasons inside these. So dangerous delegation, there are several different types of dangerous delegation that can be exploited. But if we take one here with unconstrained delegation, we're going to go ahead and open it up. And we're now going to start to understand exactly what unconstrained delegation means. Why is this vulnerable? What attribute, what value makes this particular object vulnerable to unconstrained delegation? And then what an attacker can do with this particular object. And we're also going to be able to filter by reasons if you wanted to target a particular reason, and filter by domain. Lastly, we're going to start to detail the recommendations here that you as an organization can now take to remediate these steps. So we're not just presenting a big list of problems and expecting you and your teams to go off and start to investigate these issues or start to maybe understand what they mean or start spending hours trawling through Google to look for the associated fixes. We're going to try and provide all that detail into a single pane of glass so you can understand exactly what's going on. And this is about, again, reducing the time that it's going to take to not only investigate and understand what's happening, but also the time to remediation. Now that's how we start to group, color code, and prioritize these by severities. But we're also going to be able to track these day-to-day changes and understand exactly what's going on. So if we take dangerous Kerberos delegation, for example, we're going to go to the trail flow here where we start to see a bit like the security log, but these events, these replication events coming through in real time. We're going to be able to open up an Active Directory domain controller, and we're going to go ahead and add a computer account. And this could be for an application. Let's go ahead and do it that way. So we could just call this application server, for example. And as and when we create these new objects and we start to make these changes, we see the events coming through in the background, and that's Active Directory pushing us this information. So anytime we make a change, anytime an individual makes a change, this could be an attacker performing malicious actions, we're going to see exactly what's happening as it replicates between the DCs. Now, if I were to go ahead and configure unconstrained delegation, I'm going to right-click on this object. I'm going to go to the delegation tab, and I'm going to trust this computer for delegation to any service or any Kerberos service. Now, when I go ahead and apply this change, what I'm going to get is a new event come through, and I'm also going to get an alert firing immediately in the bottom left-hand corner there to say that we've noticed unconstrained delegation against an object. Now, again, very quickly, we push that information as we see it. We're going to be able to open up each of these events, and we're going to be able to see the detail behind what these objects are, what they're doing. We're going to get the attributes that changed here, and we're going to be able to see the delta between these particular events. What was the value before? What was the new value here? And what actually changed in this particular object? When we go to the Deviants tab, we're going to be able to see unconstrained delegation. Again, we're going to start to detail why this is important. and what changed or why this object has now been flagged as an unconstrained delegation target. When I go back to my indicator of exposure and go back to the dangerous delegation indicator and go to that deviant objects tab, at the bottom of the list, we're also going to see the application server there, the one that I've just created and introduced that risk into, appearing in that list. Now, if I could go ahead and follow those recommendations and just reverse that change and remediate that particular risk, I can go to delegation. I'm going to set this to do not trust this computer for delegation. I'm going to go ahead and apply that change. And as I do, I'm going to go back into dangerous delegation, deviant objects, and we now see that server completely disappearing from that list. And very quickly as we've remediated and resolved that issue, it's updating, this interface is updating in real time, and we're going to be able to go ahead and see the fruits of our labor. Now, we're also going to be able to threat hunt and do forensic investigations across this information. So as a very basic search, we save a history, we can save bookmarks, and I can go ahead and look at all the changes made to my machine there, the application server. Very quickly, we're going to be able to refine these results, we're going to be able to feed them back, and we're going to be able to understand exactly what happened. We see a brand new object being created, we see a risk being introduced to a little red diamond, where we can see, again, the changed attributes at the top here, and the values associated to those particular changes. We're also going to put a little resolve timestamp so that we can very quickly start to understand when this issue was first created, which is the line through here, the strike through text, and we're going to put a little green bit of text next to it to say exactly when that issue was resolved. So we can start to understand and track how long these vulnerabilities, these misconfigurations were inside the environment for before we went ahead and resolved them. That's also important to be able to feed this information into existing investments that you may already have. So SIM, for example, being able to alert on misconfigurations that are being introduced, misconfigurations that may be happening through a malicious insider, an attacker, or even just a genuine mistake made by an administrator. We're going to go ahead and add a syslog alert, where we're going to go ahead and choose where we want to send this information to, how we want to trigger the alert. We have a drop-down box, and if we're looking at those deviances, those misconfigurations, we're then going to be able to choose through a tick box exercise exactly which ones we want to send out. They're very quick, very easy, and that's going to help bring together infrastructure teams, security teams, AD administrator teams to start understanding and owning these misconfigurations, these vulnerabilities that attackers are looking to exploit on a daily basis, all the time, to be able to get hold of privileges to perform those common attacks that we see, or ultimately holding the business to ransom. Now, as I just head back to my presentation, we're going to go ahead and just close out with the finishing deck there, and I think with about 10 minutes left, that's going to take us on to a Q&A session, or I can hand back to Toby, I think, even.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Chris. Let me just share my screen again very quickly. Hopefully you can all see that. So hopefully you've all found that interesting. Some really great information from Kieran and Chris there. I'd like to think we've demonstrated at least two things. One, that perhaps this is an area that does have its complexities and its intricacies, but I also hope we've shown that there are tools and help out there to help you tackle it, and maintain a more secure environment and infrastructure. What I'd also like to suggest and point your attention to is one of the workshops in particular that we do here at Bytes, free of charge. There's no cost associated to these. Hopefully it's just adding a bit of value back to your business, specifically around application and risk management. Now, this will touch on a lot of the subjects that we've touched on today, and it's a bit of an opportunity to have yes, a bit of a market overview of some of the technologies out there, but more so to look at the typical challenges that these types of technologies are there to address, some of which we've highlighted from F5 and Tenable today. If that's something that you think would be worthwhile for yourselves, reach out to your Bytes account manager or drop a note over to tellmemore@bytes.co.uk. and we'll be happy to accommodate and get you booked on for a session with us. Now, I'd like to point your attention again to the Q&A box. We've had a few in already, a couple in fact, so I will get to those in a minute. Anyone else that has a burning question off the back of anything that Kieran or Chris have discussed today, do chuck it into the box. But other than that, I will proceed with the couple that we've got so far. The first one definitely looks like it's addressed to Kieran, and it says, can we use Azure AD conditional access in the F5/Azure AD use case?
Yeah, absolutely. So no problem with that. And I think the key thing to remember there is just that we can not only use it with the applications that are in the cloud, but also those ones that are on premises, those legacy applications.
Perfect, thanks for that, Kieran. Another question, what if my application I'm trying to integrate doesn't support modern security protocols like TLS 1.3?
Yeah, this one probably didn't go into in as much depth, but the F5 is essentially an abstraction to your backend application. And it's an abstraction on multiple different layers. So right the way down to the client never actually talks to your application. We do a complete three-way handshake, abstract that and do another one to the backend client. But because of that complete network abstraction, it means we can do lots of protocol abstraction. So things like if your backend server only supports SSL version 3 and you need to be able to present that to the outside world as TLS 1.2, 1.3, we can do that. If your backend application only talks, certain authentication protocols, but you need to talk modern authentication on the front end, we can do that. So legacy applications that don't support modern SSL stacks is quite a common use case that we see with customers where they say, can we stick an F5 in front of it so we can present this to the outside world or publish it into different clouds via things like our Azure integration.
Great, thanks, Kieran. I think I've got one more for you here, and Chris, I promise I got a few questions for you coming up as well. So Kieran, another one for you. Question says, my organization is currently renewing our infrastructure and it's currently looking like we'll stay on-prem. I'm currently investigating utilizing Azure AD in addition to Microsoft AD on-prem. Would this be possible, and would this create redundancy by having a DC in the cloud in addition to on-prem?
Yeah, so maybe not redundancy in the way that you think if one went down, the other one would take over, but it certainly allows for you to utilize both, your on-premises AD and your Azure AD, and you can write policy into the F5 based on either context or maybe even some group information, so that when that user tries to access an application, the first thing the F5 can do is say, right, is this a user that IT have migrated into Azure AD? If so, go and use that identity store. Or is this a user that's still on the local AD? If so, use that identity store. So as far as the client's concerned, he just logs in, or they just log in. And he doesn't care about whether I've been migrated or not, and whether I have to go to a different domain to access that application. So it does allow you to use both identity stores, but having that policy in place allows for a seamless user experience.
Perfect, thanks for that, Kieran. Chris, question for you. We have a subscription for Tenable.io. Does that allow us to access Tenable AD, or is it a separate product? I think I know the answer to this one, but Chris, we'll let you.
Yeah, good question. At the moment, it is a completely separate product. I don't know if there are any plans to change that, but what I will say, obviously we were acquired in April. There's a lot of development about how we start to integrate the AD piece into the wider Tenable portfolio, whether that's IO, SC, Lumin, for example, for risk-based scoring. So there's lots of conversations happening, there's lots of development, but at some point there will be a wider integration path there as well.
Great, thanks, Chris. Very quick question for you as well. How is Tenable priced? I assume we're talking specifically about Tenable AD, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that will be based on number of active users within the directories, right?
Yeah, correct. It's based on enabled users. So
Yeah.
quite hard to distinguish what an active user looks like. So we license on enabled users.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Got another one for you here, Chris. When administering servers, is it best practice to use RDP or administer from the local machine with MMC or RSAT, bearing in mind cached credentials and pass the hash?
Yeah, good question. Like, when you're talking about cache credentials and pass the hash, really any way that doesn't store those credentials in memory. The only way of kind of removing those credentials from memory once you do log in or manage and administer that machine is rebooting that machine. It's one of the quickest and the cleanest ways to do it. But there's so many more things beyond just kind of logging on, using net sessions, RDP, for example, interactive logons. I think it's about making sure that the right logons are using that, and delegation is a much better way of doing it, instead of using sort of domain admins or enterprise admin accounts. Make sure delegation is granted to those objects so that they can only manage those particular devices, and you can always remove the delegation after.
Perfect, thanks, Chris. I've got one last one, but I feel like it's maybe a bit of a curveball, perhaps, and maybe warrants a bit more time than the 2 minutes we have left. But we'll give it a go anyway. And if we can't get a full answer, we'll follow up an email for sure. But the last question is: how is Tenable's solution different to or improves on Defender for Identity from Microsoft?
Very good question. So MDI has kind of evolved now from where it originally started as ATA and ATP. MDI is very heavily focused on post-compromise and breach detection. So looking for pass the hash, pass the ticket, golden tickets, for example, remote code execution, AD enumeration exercises, whereas Tenable AD is much more focused around that kind of core vulnerability management and weakness play. So what we're looking at is, again, leveraging attack paths and how attackers look to move laterally and escalate privileges. And we're going to look at existing configurations. We're going to track those changes. We're going to give you the ability to do threat hunting and forensic investigations, which MDI doesn't give you. MDI only gives you the ability to flag those alerts and understand attacks through post-compromise and breach detection. Again, we can go into a lot more detail. We can take that offline, but that's a very, very quick summary of how we differ. A lot of our customers use the two side by side, one to proactively harden the Active Directory environment, and they use MDI for breach detection.
Excellent, thanks, Chris. We do have a couple more questions, but sadly we've run out of time. What we will do, though, is we'll address those as part of the follow-up with anyone whose questions I've missed out there. But thank you very much for chucking those all our way. That's been really useful discussion points for sure. Lastly, I'd just like to thank you all for your time again. Hopefully you found it a useful hour of your morning. If you do have any questions, reach out to your Bytes account manager, reach out to tell me more at bytes.co.uk. We'll be more than happy to put you in touch with Chris and Kieran if you had direct questions for them as well. But thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks all.
Thanks everyone, take care.